planning ahead on doing anything, just when they're first aware of a wish or an urge to act arises in them, they were supposed to wiggle their finger. And that would be, at the same time, the brain would be monitored in that experiment, and lo and behold, it turns out that you have indicators in the brain before the person is consciously aware of wanting to do something and wiggling the finger or something. So that's what people call a readiness potential that builds up in the brain before you are consciously aware of wanting to do something. All right, so then the conclusion is, obviously your brain is doing something before your conscious decision, therefore your conscious decision is just the outcome of your brain processes. And what you do is basically an ex post confabulation of what's going to happen. And so in that sense it is similar to, say, alien hand syndrome. You know the movie Dr. Strangelove, you know? So he always has to contain his arm. But basically your body is moving and doing stuff unbeknownst to you or independently from your decision. And but there are also cases like in schizophrenia, people think other people are controlling their body and doing things, and whereas it's really their own unconsciousness doing that. Or other cases where you have done something without obviously having any made any decision, but then ex post, you know, you confabulate a story about how you decided to do that, and there are actually other reasons and so forth. And so the question then is, are all our decisions of that sort? You know? Do we always confabulate after the fact that we have made a rational choice, whereas our brains, our hormones, our subconsciousness, our wirings, our associations do that, and you're just not aware of that mechanism? I mean, it is basically a variation on the general hermeneutics of suspicion, you know, where you say, well, you think you have reasons for X, Y, or Z, but it's really, you know, you're part of the economic structure. You know, it's just like the Marxist account. You know, the basis, the economic basis determines the superstructure of your consciousness and your thoughts, and your thoughts are basically rationalizations of an economic interest that's underlying that. Or Sigmund Freud, you know, it's perhaps expressions of a neurosis that you have had, and your worldview is basically the rationalization of something that drives it from a totally different angle that you're not even aware of. And so there are a number of these hermeneutics of suspicion that you have, masters of suspicion. And so it's all about debunking our view of ourselves or our worldview by pointing to the underlying causes. And so now, if that's so, what should we say to that? I mean, do you have any initial reactions to that?
Well, you know, I think in the book, sort of, the last name, I didn't get the last name here.
Leave it, I don't know.
Yeah. So it just seemed to me that the experiment was already determined, predetermined, and that you got to move your finger, so you know that's going to happen, and it's bounded by an interval of time. So your finger is going to move
think there's some truth to it, and I can clarify what that is. Other ideas, thoughts?
He seems to be looking at a very specific kind of choice and action. I mean, I think this is very different than a deliberation or a very thought out decision making about what am I going to do for my career, for example.
Yes.
So it might offer certain insight into menial decisions, but I don't think you can really comment on decision making as a whole, which is a large part of free will.
You're right.
It's very limited.
It's something important, I think. Yeah. More ideas? I mean, people might ask you these questions, right? If you don't agree with that, you better have some reasons. So, but I mean, Benjamin Libet himself actually thought that there could be something more here that we still have, namely a veto. So maybe we cannot do anything independently from these readiness potentials, but we don't have to follow them, so we can veto them. So at least to give some allowance there, but that actually also is not very convincing. So from the standpoint of the physics or physiology, it would be using the same brain regions that also the readiness potential is using. And so there's no reason, or why would one think that one cannot do something against the readiness potential, but then do the vetoing, which would be against that, or would be using the same kind of thing. So either it's all determinate, or none of that is determinate. And so this not having free will but free won't, as somebody has says, doesn't do a whole lot either. And the question is, do we think of free will as just a form of inhibition, like trying to inhibit a sneeze or something like that? That would be not a very great idea of what free will is. And so, but there are fundamental problems with that assumption. And I think the first problem is, if we say this experiment has given us reasons to disbelieve in free will, the first question is to ask, what status does that theory have that's based on this experiment? They claim to give us reasons for believing what they're saying. But can you actually follow reasons if you don't have free will? There's something in our very structure of thinking about things, not even about action, but even thinking about things, that requires us to be free from causal determination. If even our theories are determined by our brain processes, then we are not free to reason. We have to follow causes, but not reasons. And there are two different sets of things. For example, if somebody claims this theory and says, no, we don't have free will, then there might be someone else who opposes that, like myself, right? And based on that theory, both of us would be determined by our brain processes. Now, what's right or wrong here, or based on what is that going to be settled? Either one or the other would need to transcend the causalities there to change his or her mind. And presumably, if you have an argument about that, both of that would need to be able to abstract from these processes to evaluate whether the one or the other is correct. So, in a way, the causal processes of the brain, whatever they determine or don't determine, need to be evaluated with regard to whether they produce truth or not. That's similar to a suggestion that Edmund Husserl made about, let's say you have two calculation machines, and or even just one, and so you want the machine to produce valid mathematical calculations, but the machine is always spitting out 2 + 2 is 5. something is going wrong. But what does it mean that something is going wrong here? Does it mean that the machine just broke the laws of nature, the laws of mechanics perhaps, or of electromechanics if it's a computer? Does the machine break those laws? No, the laws of nature are descriptive laws. They just describe how things work and always work. You cannot break them, otherwise there wouldn't be laws of nature. Nevertheless, something is broken. So that which is broken must be different from those laws, and that is the laws of mathematics. And whether 2 plus 2 is 5, if the machine is always spitting that out, whether 2 plus 2 is 5 is true or false is not decided on the mechanics of the machine, but on the reasons that mathematics provides to you. And they're therefore different. They're prescriptive laws, as we say, and the others are descriptive. You can break prescriptive laws, but not descriptive laws. Which means you have to be free to follow these prescriptive laws or not. You can break a code of criminal law, you can break traffic laws. That means you are free to either do it or not do it. And so if we are trying to evaluate even the status of the theory itself, you must be appealing to some forms of rationality, whether that's mathematics or logic or whatever is coming into play. And it cannot be already determined by descriptive laws, which would be true if that claim is true. If everything is determined by the brain processes and they are following just natural laws of nature, and that is descriptively true, they themselves don't give us any reason to evaluate the outcome. The outcome can be A or non-A, and so if you want to evaluate it, you need to take a step back and be free to reason about it. So that's itself a form of freedom that is required even in casting in a theory like that. And so based on its own assumptions, that theory cannot claim anything. At best it can claim the brain processes of Benjamin Libet or something like that, and someone else might have different brain processes, and that's neither here nor there, So the very status of the theory seems to be undermined, and start undermining. C.S. Lewis points that out in his book on miracles too, that there is something where we do transcend the laws of nature, the naturalism that goes with that. And he says, it's an interesting formulation that we have. He says, you can say thought B followed from A, or we can say thought B follows from A. If we say thought B follows from A, then we will claim there's a timeless truth to that. That's based on the laws of logic. You can formulate a syllogism. You can make an argument, and there is that kind of necessity that B follows from A by reason itself. But if you're talking about brain physiology, we will say thought B followed from A. It could have been different, but based on a different brain physiology or different initial conditions. There's nothing timelessly true about that. It is just contingent on this particular brain at this particular point in space and time. So again, there's a difference between causes and reasons, between laws of nature and laws of reason and argument. So if that experiment is true, we have no reason to assume that it is true. Basically, that's where it's self-refuting. So that's the first thing. Maybe I can list here. Let's try to get self-refuting. It's not free to follow reasons. It has also been pointed out that Leavitt also needs to assume free will in the people who are in that experiment, because he relies on them telling him the truth about what they did in that experiment. Right? So they system, you know, or give a little bit false evidence or something like that. Thing that's going to fool around with this or something of that sort. So there's certain standard that he thinks they are free to follow, an ethical standard or a standard of honesty or something like that. Based on brain physiology, why would one assume that? You know, I mean, that could be either this or the other thing. I mean, it could be for or against that assumption. So that also is a problem.
So basically, our brain could be wired to tell the truth or to tell
It
a
could,
lie.
but that's would be sort of random. I mean, it might also be wired to tell falsehood, you know, depending on whatever comes into a brain. And so there's the reliability of what the subjects tell the experimenter, you know, is sort of in question with that. I mean, instructions. I mean, if you follow instructions in an experiment, instructions are prescriptive laws, if you want. You know, there are things you can break, right? Just as you can break the laws of mathematics by miscalculating. But also notice what the subjects are asked to do. They're asked to press the button when they experience an urge to act. That's a very odd formulation, you know. I think first thing to notice is this makes the whole experiment into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because they're just waiting for a readiness potential to emerge, right? I mean, what else is that? I mean, you could have saved yourself the trouble. I mean, it's obvious that this would be the outcome, you know. So, what is the formulation against it? Oh, so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's what you're trying to prove. So it's basically the order notice a readiness potential. Also notice that it is a passive formulation. They should wait until the feeling or experience arises. It arises. You know, it, what is it? You know, who is the agent of that? You know, it's not you, obviously. You know, it's but if you talk about free will, I mean, one of the common sense understanding of what free will is, it's you who's doing that. You know, who else can decide for you or make a choice for you? It's either you or not. So we become basically bystanders and observers of our own experiences. You know? That's not a stand for free choice. So we are not the doers, as we should assume if you're looking for free will and making decisions. Deciding is not something that anyone else can do for us, and even less anything else can do for us. You know, you cannot ask a computer to make a choice for you, then it's not your choice. You know, it's just, nor can you ask your brain to make a choice for you. At least, well, we'll have to qualify some of that later, but first of all, just at the very basis of that, it must be something you do. Just as little as anybody else can think for you. You know, Immanuel Kant says, the I think is that which must be able to accompany all my conscious thought and so forth, is because you are thinking that. It's your thought. And so if it's your choice, it's also something you do and not it, something. And so basically, the setup of the experiment asked us to let our choices be determined by something else than we ourselves are, and of which we are only the observers. So why that is supposed to be a good experiment or test for free will, I don't know. This is really mind-boggling if you come to think of it. So why would we expect anything else but the readiness potential to precede somehow? But, as Edward Feser has says, feeling an urge to sneeze does not make a sneeze voluntary. It's a passive formulation. Talking about this formulation, it's passive. But if you're talking about an experience of an urge to act, it sounds like a feeling. We experience something means we feel something in us, an urge. But is free will something like a feeling? There are people who have said things like that, and I would suggest, no, that's going precisely wrong. Free will is not a feeling, not even a feeling of spontaneity or creativity. Any feeling will have brain states correlated with it, and therefore will be subject to causalities in the brain. It's not surprising, again, that we would observe anything there. But none of them will be free in the sense that free will must be free. Thomas Aquinas would say that the intellect and the will, as spiritual faculties of the soul, don't have a physical organ. And this is one of the reasons for that. If you talk about free will, if free will had a physical organ, then it would be subject to the causalities that are going on in physical structures. And it couldn't be free on that account. But any feeling will be correlated with physical organs, with the limbic system or hormones or whatever it might be. But there have been things in the past arguments for free will that appeal to our self-experience as being free. Descartes might say things like that. So it's introspective, looking at yourself, but as a kind of a primal experience that I know myself to be free, and these experiments cannot really doubt that, and so forth. I'm not sure that's a good argument. Any experience that you have is subject to debunking. People telling you it's a hallucination, or I can explain to you where that feeling comes from, because that's always happening if the brain does X, Y, or Z, and so forth. So there is good reason sometimes, depending on the kind of experience you're talking about, but there is good reason to be somewhat, look at our experience with mental reservation, basically. And I'm not sure that is really what free will is in any case. You might make free decisions without having any of these experiences. What you're looking for is in some way the experience of some kind of an efficient causality where you move something. And again, that might be there, might not be there. But it's easy to caricature that. So Daniel Dennett, for example, says, well, then it's something like a sort of radiation generated by gritting the teeth and saying, move, move, move. So if that's your experience, and you're trying to move something, or focusing on it, if you're looking for that, I for one, it can be debunked, but also we don't do that very often, do we? Even William James's definition of the will is an effort of attention. Still has these elements. So attention, that we can freely focus our attention, I think there's certainly some truth about it, and it puts actually a more cognitive aspect on it, which is important. But it's still sort of the aspect of an effort that we are making, that the free will is connected with the experience of such an effort. Or phenomenological accounts, Alexander Pfänder, for example, would say that it has nothing to do, if we experience ourselves to act freely, we don't add anything to the content of what we do or decide, but it's a modification of our self-experience. Ich-Gefühl, it says. And I think that's precisely wrong. It's not an experience of us modifying our experience or something like that. It has precisely to do with the cognitive content of what we are doing, because it has to do with rational deliberation. That's the primary evidence for free will. And that's what Aquinas would say. It is the former or species of what we deliberate about that gives us an indication for free will. And we'll have to say more about that in a moment. So, but Wittgenstein, asked, what is it that remains of the fact? What is it that remains if I subtract from the fact that I want to lift my arm, that my arm lifts? So, I want to lift my arm. I do it. You say, let's subtract from that my arm lifts. Then he says, what remains then? And the suggestion is nothing remains. I think that's wrong. It might seem like that if you are looking for a particular additional experience. But obviously what remains is your intention to raise your arm. That's not nothing. It might not be an experience, but it is an intention that you have, and it's an important thing. Otherwise, it is indeed indistinguishable from alien hand syndrome, like Dr. Strangelove. But I mean, that is itself an experience. He experiences that something happens in his arm that he didn't decide to do, right? So we make that distinction. What is implied in us making that distinction? If that's the normal case, if all cases are like alien hand syndrome, we wouldn't even notice the difference. But we do. We know the difference. So will is not sort of a blind force, efficient causality, moving, and so forth and so on. It is something that has to do with, Aquinas would say, final causality. We have ends and we have rational ends that we deliberate about. And looking at those will be an indication for freedom. Yes?
Would Wittgenstein have talked about the various experiences, prejudgments that we bring to that moment where we actually act? Would he talk about free will being compromised in one way or another by who we are as a person?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's so much his concern. I mean, his concern is more to undercut dualisms, I think. Let's say you have a mind and you have matter, and mind is acting on matter or something like that, or you have the will here, and then you have the motion of your arm there. And so all these kind of Cartesianisms and so forth, I think, are a bit of his target there. And Wittgenstein is complex, of course, but basically he wants that to be one thing. The movement of your arm and your will to move your arm. And I sort of understand that in some sense, but if you say that nothing is left, basically, or imply that nothing is left, if you just subtract the physical motion of your arm from you wanting to lift your arm, if there's nothing left, well, then again, it's like the alien hand syndrome. We do make that distinction. What is left is indeed our intention, but it's not another feeling or something we add to it. Or that we find by introspection in that way. Again, feelings are also passive, so we come back to that again. If you feel hungry, or even angry, right? You might really, you might go to anger management classes, right? Because you don't want that anger, right? Feelings are not something we choose, and we're also not responsible for them unless we nourish, in anger to become, hatred or something like that. But feelings are just coming and going. They arise. They're precisely not what we choose. So to make free will a matter of feelings would mean it's precisely one of those things we don't choose. it would indeed just arise. Why would we call that free will? So there are a lot of problems with that approach, but it does tie even to older ideas about where we look for free will. So, but if it's not feelings, then we have to look among reasons for that. So we deliberate about means and ends, we deliberate about what the good is, what the right moral choice is, according to reasons indeed, not causes. So we must be free to deliberate that. But as Aquinas will point out, that would be a larger topic, we deliberate about universal goals, or under the auspices of a universal end, the good itself, our final good, the summum bonum. And that's not any of the particulars that we encounter in our life, and that perhaps our senses suggest to us, our brains communicate in some way or make available. That is what we deliberate about. And reason leaves us free with regard to particular choices because it is making us look at these things under the auspices of the universal good. That would require, of course, more explanation, but it is about rational intentions, basically. And just to know that we deliberate on that level means already that we are free from these particulars, including what our physiology suggests to us or our feelings give to us. That doesn't even arise in this experiment. In fact, it is explicitly excluded. The experiment asks the subject to wiggle the finger without planning ahead, without thinking. Why would we think that this is a case of free will? Why would you actually exclude that explicitly? Obviously you're not going to test free will. Once you have to come to understand that this is what reason, that reason is involved there. Just to give you a sort of, maybe it's more a hominem argument, but for how reason is involved in free choice. So an example I like is, suppose somebody puts two envelopes in front of you. It says closed envelopes. One contains $1 million, check of $1 million, and the other contains your death sentence. Now choose. All right, I have free will, I can choose one or the other, and so I choose one, and lo and behold, it's your death sentence. What will you say? Well, I didn't want that. Yes, you did. Nobody forced you. It was your free choice. So there you are. No, but I did not know what I was choosing. We don't think that we have made a free choice if we don't know what we are doing. We must have rational choice. We must have deliberation. Now, deliberation in itself, if you ask what that means, is you weigh certain options. And again, as Aquinas would point out, under the auspices of the universal good, for which all these are subordinate goods that are like means to an end, that we can reason about by our liberum arbitrium. But to make comparisons, to correlate things in that way, is not something any sensual faculty can give you. That is something only reason can do. Only reason can correlate, compare, and relate in that way, Aquinas would say. So the very act of deliberation must lift us beyond the realm of the sensual, and with that also beyond brain physiology in some way. But all of that is excluded. By design of the experiment. And again, you might ask, why? You could have left it open, but if you exclude that, what are you actually trying to do? But also notice, there is actually a choice, a free choice involved here. What is that free choice? It's the choice to enter the experiment. You talked about sure, I'm going to do this, and I'm signing the contract here and all that, and I agree freely to follow your instructions,
Did they know what they were doing?
No, they didn't know what they were doing, probably not. But to a certain extent, they did, because they understood what they were asked to do, whatever, people were then theorizing about it later, but they must have understood that, and they made a free, deliberate choice. It was not merely a readiness potential telling them that blindly or something like that. And even to say, well, I'm just waiting for the readiness potential to rise, or my urge to rise, and not to interfere with it. You must be able to refrain from interfering. That's a free choice, So it's really strange if you come to think about it. That you would think this is a good experiment for free will, but not to interfere with it. So the non-interference, that might be your choice, and you make that ahead of time by entering the experiment. But you're not interfering with it. That is not with you or your choice, but with something else that you merely observe. Why would that be a case of free choice? Now there are choices of that kind, even in everyday life. If you set your alarm clock, and the alarm clock rings and you wake up in the morning and say, now I have to get out of bed. And okay, I decide to get up. Well, you might be lingering a little bit in bed, right? And usually, there's a certain point where we feel ready to get up, and and somehow we find ourselves outside of bed at some point. It sort of happened at some point, and in retrospect, we don't quite know how it happened. Does that mean there's no choice involved here? I think there is. So we do decide to get up, but the precise point when we are going to do that, we sort of we let that be done by the readiness potentials, basically. That's perfectly fine. That's. You could also by sheer willpower do that. But normally, perhaps that's not what we are doing, depending on how disciplined we are. But that means still what is happening with the readiness potentials is still governed by the overarching decision of the will. And I think many of our actions, our free choices, are of that sort. But one shouldn't confuse it in saying that, well, just because we can measure these readiness potentials, free will isn't involved in that at all. So you must know where to look for what you're looking, and take the larger picture into account. But that would be not unlike that experiment. You choose to enter the experiment and then let your readiness potentials determine when you wiggle your finger. But there is an overarching decision with that, namely the decision to enter that experiment. Or even if you, examples people like playing tennis. So you can measure your brain functions while you're playing tennis, and of course you have a lot of automatic responses. You couldn't think that quickly to respond to the ball. You have a lot of that in your muscle memory and so forth. Does that mean you're not playing tennis voluntarily? No, you chose to enter the match, right? And so there is an overarching decision that governs that, but you let the rest be worked out by what you have trained yourself to do. It's still yours. The very training, in a way, is by choice, and therefore the skills you build up are yours. You own them in a way, because there is, as the remote cause for that, your choice to enter into the training. So they are actually your own. You have some ownership of that. So even if in the moment it's not all free choices or sequence of free choices, it is still governed by it. It's almost like not even a remote cause and then the subsequent steps. It is more like a part-whole relationship. The whole of that is governed by the choice, but the details are worked out on a different level, the parts of the whole sequence of motion and so forth. So, but that basically means it is the look at this is too close up, if you want, you know. Perhaps, you know, to spell that out a little further, what rational deliberation means. Let's see. There's something that Aristotle observes, namely that we cannot choose what is impossible. You might wish it, but you cannot will it. If you know something to be impossible, that is not something that you can rationally want. You know, you can wish it, but that's sort of on the level of feeling, but it is not something you can rationally choose. As Alberton says, even God cannot eat Chicago. It wouldn't be a rational intention that God could formulate that he wants to eat Chicago. It's not because Chicago is too big as it would be for us, because God doesn't have a digestive tract or something like that. You know? He says it's not. We cannot even envision what it means to have a rational decision to jump over a building or skyscraper. You know, might imagine ourselves crouching, taking a leap or something, but that's not really the same as having the intention to jump over a skyscraper. That would be really, or to trying to wiggle your teeth, he says. You wouldn't know how to go about that. So all of these would be cases of something that's possible that we know to be impossible. And therefore we cannot freely choose it because free choice presupposes rational deliberation. So it's another way in which that becomes obvious. As Immanuel Kant also would say, there's a different kind of necessity to the rules of deliberation than to the rules of the laws of nature. So, if the categorical imperative tells me you must do A, the must here has a certain kind of necessity, but it's not the necessity of the laws of nature because you can refuse to do so. Could be actually that you're doing something else, and that doesn't falsify the law of the moral law. You know? It retains its necessity even if it's not actualized, which is odd. Some sense of moral logic. You know? But it means we are living under a different kind of necessity, namely that of the moral law. Maybe that's another way of saying what Aquinas says. It says we're choosing under the universal, the auspices of the universal good, and we are left free with regard to the details, therefore. You can play chess and lose, or you have to have a certain kind of move, and somebody says, well, you had no alternative, you just had to do that. What's the sense of having to do this? Well, you could have just thrown over the chessboard and walked out, didn't have to do anything, right? I mean, this is not the kind of must or ought that we are, or no alternative that we're talking about, nor is it the determination by brain potentials. So that's just to illustrate a bit further this deliberation aspect. Now, to shift gears a little bit. So all of that means we have free will in some sense of the word, and it has to do with rational intentions. Does that mean that our brains play no role? Just give some examples where it does play a role, getting out of bed or something like that. And does that already settle to which degree we are free? I mean, if you ask somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre, we are totally free. We're responsible for just about anything in our life, including for when we are born, or whether we are alive. Because we always commit suicide. It's always this ultimate act of free will to deny and negate just anything. So Sartre would be very strong on that free will is basically without boundaries. Now, if you ask Thomas Aquinas what he thinks about that, I think it would be neither on the side of Sartre nor on the side of Benjamin Libet. He actually has a way of accounting in a very differentiated way of how human life works and how free will fits into that. So he actually goes into quite a bit of detail. And I mean, Thomas Aquinas doesn't know about brain physiology and genetics or whatever else might determine us, or laws of nature in the modern sense. But he goes into quite a bit of detail about our faculties and on the human organism and what is and what is not in the control of our free will. So, and the answer is not simple, you know. So there are things we cannot control by free will, such as our heartbeat. Maybe some fakirs in India can, but normally that's part of the vegetative system and so forth that we don't control by our free will, or our nervous system at large. You know? Our nutrition, our digestive tract works independently from what we decide, you know, sometimes to our disadvantage. You know? Or our procreative functions, sometimes to our embarrassment, you know, and St. Augustine actually thinks that's only part of the consequences of the fall, you know, that they are not under the control of our free will. Aquinas actually disagrees on that. It says that's by nature that they have a life of their own, and even to the point of embarrassment. So there are parts of our organism that are not under the control of free will. If you look at our internal senses, and first of all, our external senses, you know, are not under our control. If I touch the hot stove, it's not my choice not to feel pain. You know, so that forces itself on me, and it's not subject to my freedom. If we go to the internal faculties, the imagination and memory and such, it does become a bit more differentiated. So I certainly can decide to search my memory for something. You know. I can freely conjure up images, but not all of them. You know. Some images might flash into my mind without me wanting it. I might have involuntary associations and so forth. Here Aquinas would say we have an indirect control over these. Perhaps even for the external senses. So maybe I cannot choose to feel pain if I put my hand on a hot stove, but I can choose not to touch it or to put my hand elsewhere. So what is in my control typically is locomotion. Again, lifting my arm or something like that. And with that we can have an indirect control over what's going on in our internal senses and so forth. So if your imagination gives you trouble because it puts imagination before your mind, well, you might just leave the room and go look at something else to distract yourself, you know, something of that sort. That's locomotion, you know. We can use our motor faculties to go somewhere else and distract ourselves. That can be true for little occasions of sin, but also our imagination. And reason, again, can help with that. You know? So you can indeed deliberate about choices you make to indirectly control these things, to take the right kind of actions. But you can even just internally rethink your thought processes or your involuntary kind of imaginations coming up. So people do that all the time in cognitive therapy. You know? So there are certain responses that are unhealthy that we have internally, and so we can cognitively come to rethink that. And Aquinas would say the same thing. So we have not only our internal senses, imagination, memory, and so forth, but also reason that, in a way, interacts with these and has an influence on them. And all of that is, you know, pretty commonsensical if you come to think of it. But it also means the picture is rather differentiated. And so to make blanket statements is probably not the best idea here, in one way or the other. Now, when it comes to Aquinas, it's less often observed that, and I have a few passages that I can demonstrate that so from what I see him saying is, our will is never interacting with the rest of our organism or other faculties. It's never directly connected with it, but only by way of the intellect. So it's not that our emotions can move our will. Aquinas thinks that probably that would really make our free will, if it's a continuum, it would make it dependent on that and determine basically our emotions. Our emotions can suggest something, so our readiness potentials bring up a certain urge or something like that, but that is then connected by the will to the will, if it is a free decision, only by the interface of the intellect that deliberates about that. And then makes some decision about it. So we are acting in view of our desire, not acting from desire. And the other way around too. So your will can never directly move your emotions, as I said earlier. You cannot decide to fall in love. Maybe some people cannot think they can, or you cannot simply decide to become angry. You can work yourself up, but that's again another indirect kind of way. Or you can think long and hard enough about your enemy until you're really angry. But it's always by interface of the intellect, and that means the will is removed from that, and in that sense you can it is also left free from it. So it goes both ways. And so it's always mediated by by rational objects through which the will operates. Otherwise it's not an act of the will at all. Now if we distort our thought processes, that can affect our free choices. So if you take if you take drugs that affect your brain, or drink too much alcohol, that does mess with your brain. Does it mess with your free will? Well, again, only indirectly so. Or if your readiness potential is so strong that you cannot help doing something. Well, what it does is it will mess with your thought processes, not directly with the will. So you cannot focus on what the rational choice might be in this case. Your intellect might be dragged along by hallucinations or something like that. It affects your internal senses and the imagination, because that has to do with the brain, and therefore does not give your reason the proper basis for deliberation. So you cannot marshal up all the necessary evidence or whatever it might be. And here is then indeed where we would say that action cannot be imputed to someone, or it cannot be held accountable for that. A judge might say that, and that's where psychiatry comes in. Psychiatrists will help you with medication, perhaps to make your brain operate more normal, so that your thought processes are free to do what they need to do, so that you can also make really free choices based on that. So all of that is perfectly intelligible on Thomistic accounts, I think, too, and it does involve the brain, and explains in a way why the brain might be involved, even on the level that Libet looks at, but that's of course a very low level. Emotions can sabotage our thought processes in that way. The hormones in our brain, or whatever it might be. At a certain point, the will might not. You might at least be so much aware that it says, I cannot think clearly about this, so I better use my free will and choose not to choose, and just wait until the fog is cleared up in my mind. So free will can indeed also consist in refraining from doing something, saying I'm going to wait and see until better information emerges or something like that, or I've cooled down or something. Again, very commonsensical. So these things, and these things do allow for degrees as well. So if you act compulsively, then it's not really something you have done if it's really compulsive. If you have a seizure, it's not an act of free will. That's like alien hand syndrome indeed. Now, there are things in between. What about addictions? So if you have labored with people with addictions, I mean, at a certain point, they do have a lessening of free will. I mean, they cannot really make the right choices. And yet, there is a way in which we do hold them accountable, nevertheless. Otherwise, we would, if it's sexual addictions, they might actually commit crimes based on that. You either lock them up or you do really hold them accountable. It doesn't seem to be the same as just simply a seizure or something. So again, there are different cases. Thomas Aquinas actually says, when it comes to venial and mortal sin, there are different cases depending on whether you have grace or not, but you can probably avoid every venial sin in your life individually, distributively, as he says, but not all of them collectively. So if you look at a certain time span, and there's this range of venial sins that has been offered to you, occasions of sin, every single one you could avoid, but you would take all of them together, there's probably one or two that you will have succumbed to. So there's the distinction between a distributive and collective sense, and that is something later the Jesuits in the 16th and 17th century have picked up. And I'll come back to that in a moment, but that just illustrates, there are degrees and differentiated ways of looking at that. Aquinas also looks at various ways in which you can be determined in your inclinations, and and he's looking basically at the whole sequence of the soul. So you have the essence of the soul, you have the faculties, you have habits, you have acts, and the objects. And so you have a rational soul, and you have your faculty of the free will, and you might have certain habits of that free will, and certain acts that go with that, and that are geared towards certain objects that go with free will. At all of these, you can interfere if you want, or you speculate about how God could interfere in that too, how he influences your free will or not. God might mess even around with your soul, that nobody else can do, but God is the creator of the soul, so he could, or even the faculty itself. Now, other things might mess with your faculty if it involves a physical organ, such as the brain. So, indeed, if somebody gives you drugs, and your imagination depends on the proper working of your brain, then indeed somebody has interfered with that. Aquinas thinks that's not possible for free will because free will doesn't have a physical organ. So the acts, that's if it's your choice, it's your choice. Nobody can change that really. If it's motor faculties, somebody can move your arm against your will, right? But nobody can move your will in that same sense. So again, it depends what you're looking at, but that's habits, of course, are formed by repeated actions, and can think of cases where that might be influenced in other ways. God can infuse virtues and so forth. Now the object, that is where a lot of manipulation is possible. That's the cases I just mentioned about you can distract yourself, or indirectly influence your object by rethinking things or looking at something else and so forth. So I think that's a helpful distinction if you want to look at the human organism and how the brain might come in or not come in. Now, if the body is involved, including the brain, and there is neurophysiology, and there are readiness potentials, then the question would be, are these determined by laws of nature? If that's all fixed, then we can deliberate all we want. There's no interaction there possible or interference. It's all set by the laws of that is a perpetual kind of problem, although I think it hasn't been formulated in that strict way since Descartes. That's a really modern problem in which that has been set up. And I don't think, it depends really what you think of the laws of nature, whether they're deterministic or not. And of course, quantum mechanics, some people might say it's more statistic and so forth. There's actually much more that's possible now than people thought in the past. I also think typically people are testing for laws of nature, such as physics. They don't typically test that in human organisms. So I don't think it has ever been proved that these laws of nature hold within human organisms. That's a claim, but I don't think it has ever been proved. And if you would prove that, you will go back to the same problems we had before, and your whole theory would be self-refuting, because you cannot have a theory that says such things, right? So that's a larger problem in general. But I'm bringing that up because, again, I want to connect that also with Aquinas and see what he might have to say on that. The notion of laws of nature as mathematical laws is a modern idea that begins in the 17th century by and large. And Sir Richard Swinburne will say it did arise without any necessity from the data or evidence from the sciences. It was a paradigm shift, basically, and a different way of thinking about things. So, which means that Aquinas doesn't have that notion. So should we expect any answers to be given from Aquinas in that regard? Well, there is an analogy, I think, that we can find in Aquinas. And there is something analogous to laws of nature in Aquinas when it comes to the motion of the heavens. So in the above the sublunar sphere, the ancient cosmology, people would say the stars circle around the Earth and so forth. And that happens indeed in circles of perfect motions. They're susceptible to mathematical and geometrical kind of descriptions that operate like modern laws of nature. That's where they would be located in that science. And I think it's true by and large that modern science has taken that paradigm and put it on the subatomic level almost, or at least on the atomic level in many ways, and but also, of course, the cosmos at large. So it has made that cosmos more homogeneous in that way, but on the level of the stars that did exist according in that time of Aquinas too. And Aquinas, in that context, does raise the question about free will and how that is correlated to physical motion, namely the motion of the stars. So it sounds like a bit like astrology, and it is. So we were asking that, do the stars incline of free will to do something? Do they necessitate what we choose or not? So you say, well, it's just astrology, but it is. If you take that as an analogy to what we say today about laws of nature and how they operate in the brain, that would be a perfect analogy. The question is the same. Does that determine our free choices, just as they would have assumed for the stars in the past? Aquinas does use the best available science of his day. Today we would formulate it in this way. And so what does Aquinas say about that? Are we totally free or totally determined by the movements of the stars in this case? Well, he says neither. Again, there's not an easy answer, it's a differentiated answer. And he quotes the old saying, astra inclinant non necessitant. The stars incline, they don't necessitate. Now that's sort of, first of all, a blanket statement, but they incline certain choices, but they do not force these choices. And perhaps analogously, we might say, our genetic equipment or hormonal or neurophysiological predispositions or our readiness potentials incline us to certain choices, but we still have a choice to make. And we might at least not always follow that. And in a way, if you take that. I mean, that sounds almost disappointingly commonsensical to say that. But I think if people are counterintuitive, then probably there's something wrong with their theory too. So maybe that is actually good if it is so commonsensical. Aquinas would say that our freedom from these predispositions and inclinations depends on the degree of wisdom that we have. That is, it depends on how much we're able to deliberate about these primary urges on a larger scale, common good perhaps, or something of that sort. Do we just rush into our first impulses? Do we mindlessly respond to clickbait in the internet? Or do we simply press the button when our readiness potential is felt as an urge? Or do we rationally take a step back and look at these things and activate our liberum arbitrium? It's, for Aquinas actually, only the wise men who do that. He says most of the people follow their urges. So that is actually not an account of, an exaggerated account of free will if you come to think of it. The general population is largely dominated by the hormones and predispositions, you might say. Now that sounds perhaps somewhat elitist, but and then, you just need people to be governed by philosopher kings or something like that. But I think first of all, this is actually can be spelled out in sociological terms too. There is something like social statistics. The antecedents of that, as I said earlier, with the Jesuits in the 16th, 17th century, but especially in the 19th century, that becomes more predominant. So you have social sciences that work statistically. And Emil Durkheim, for example, is looking at suicide statistics or statistics of criminality. Now, if something is criminal behavior, the assumption is somebody is punished for having made a free choice there, right? But if that is statistically measurable, it seems that your choice is rather limited because it's predictable in a way. And it's not just criminal. I mean, David Hume already also indicates, merchants after all calculate, what kind of gain they might have based on consumer behavior, basically. And in the days of Amazon and big data mining or something like that, it's probably even more true today. How can you predict that if all of these are free choices, right? In the Jesuits I mentioned, they have they asked that question too about free will in that context, and he says, well, it might be true, statistically, that among 1,000 inhabitants of Madrid, and these were Spanish Jesuits, at least one daily commits a mortal sin. So there's a statistical law. Now suppose 999 have not mortally sinned. Are you now forced to sin mortally? Says no. It's like the rolling of dice. There might be a certain statistic outcome, but each roll of the dice is causally independent from each other, and so you're actually free to choose in each particular case, even if collectively there's a statistical outcome. So Jesuits already speculated about that in the 16th, 17th century, and they spell that out in a number of ways. Some were statistical, some were by inclinations, and so forth. But Aquinas, as I said earlier, also has an inkling of that with this collective and distributive sense of our choices. But it doesn't imply determination. It doesn't imply that we don't have free will. It does mean that there's a certain inclination, with a prima facie kind of inclination to do something, and for the most part that's probably going to play out. Well, in some way we shouldn't be surprised by that. If by nature we need food to survive, then it's not surprising that for the most part people will go and look for food. That's predictable, and consumer behavior based on that is also predictable. There's nothing so surprising about that, and it's not a matter of free will, unless you expect free will to be documented in such a way that everybody starves himself to death or something like that. So that's not an argument against free will. And if by nature we have a drive towards procreation, then it's not surprising that people, for the most part, will act on that drive. And then if theologically you say, well, it was the fall and our inclinations are also distorted, then perhaps even bad behavior associated with that will also be predictable to a certain degree, certain distortions. And they can then also be manipulated predictably, so by advertisement, by electoral campaigns, by Facebook or whatever, And all of that doesn't mean that we don't have free will. It just means that we might not use it as often as we think. That might be an exaggerated account. I mean, if you think of it, how many free choices have you made today? Really hard to count, in the first place. But I mean, if you think of that, how much reasoned, deliberated choices did we make today? Perhaps I chose the route to drive to school in a certain way today. Usually you always use the same route, and so we don't even deliberate much about that. But then everything else I did, shifting gears or something like that, that was part of a skill that's learned and didn't need to choose about. Does that make me less free? No, almost the opposite. Because if I by choice develop these skills, and I can go on autopilot with that, that actually gives me greater freedom. So first of all, the skills do give me a greater range of things I can possibly do and make decisions about. But it also leaves me free to choose about other things because I don't have to deliberate about all these things all the time. So it actually frees up my mind and therefore freedom in other ways. And I don't have to choose about all of these things all the time, and that also is not required for having free will. And so, indeed, then we might develop certain routines, we might develop certain skills, and they will rest on earlier choices, as I said earlier, also with playing tennis. And that also makes them our own. So we do take ownership of acts even if we do that sort of on autopilot. So if I drive and I have an accident, maybe that I didn't make a deliberate choice in that case, but I have a certain ownership of the acts that came even from my habitual actions. I'm willing to own that, but also for good. Even things that I do almost in autopilot for which I'm praised, well, I'm happy to accept that praise, because in some way I have ownership of who I have become. Timothy O'Connor makes that point with, was it Robert Grosseteste, these two angels. So angels don't have a history, basically, right? And so that don't live in time the way we do. So they cannot shape their habits and dispositions in the way we can, and therefore they will not own the decisions or what the outcome of that perhaps in the same way. I'm not quite sure exactly whether that's true for angels, but it illustrates sort of the point, we can own our history if we are the authors of that in a way. And there's a sense of self-formation in that, and that is actually itself an expression of free will. Even, if not every detail, always depends on explicit free choice. That even includes the acts of our intellect. Our beliefs. Our beliefs can be the outcome of choices, namely the choice to learn or to ignore certain things. And therefore there is something like culpable ignorance. You will be held accountable for that because freedom is involved in that, even if you think, well, it's not my fault if I don't know something. Well, maybe it is. Again, there's the life that you shape and the ownership that you have of your life in that way with your free acts. And so Aquinas' account is not elitist because even the wise man does not make conscious choices most of the time. But perhaps they do have a greater ownership of their life because they have made the right choices along the way. Again, as I said earlier, we don't also deliberate about natural needs like food. We do not ask ourselves whether we should eat or sleep, unless perhaps it's Lent. you know, you have to do some penances, you know, or do some fasting. But for the most part, we take our natural needs to be prima facie reasons for choosing something. And so we drink when we are thirsty without reflecting on it. Even though if somebody asks us afterwards, you know, why did you drink? Well, because I thought it's good if you're thirsty, I need something to drink. Or maybe you are not thinking really, you know, but nevertheless, I mean, you can say it's a post factum confabulation, you know, on something that you did more or less automatically based on your natural needs. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't nevertheless a rational choice, you know. You didn't have any reason to deliberate otherwise at that point, you know. And even that would be somehow integrated in a rational form of life. Looking back, we rightly think that it was a reasonable thing to do. And we confabulate a reason for it, not a feeling. Right? You might, I mean, you say, oh, just felt thirsty or something like that, you know. But in a way, if somebody asks us, why did you do that? I mean, we typically, I mean, if it's a confabulation, we look for reasons, not so much for feelings. So that is true for many things, and so we do develop these kind of routines. And in doing so, we do not lose our freedom, we gain freedom. We gain freedom to deliberate more, and the freedom, of course, to have a greater range of actions by the routines and skills that we have developed. We're free to pursue wider goals, not stuck in the humdrum decisions of the day. So I think that would be a Thomistic look at not just our brain but the whole organism. Looking at the brain is a very limited way, even on modern terms. I mean, I think at UC Berkeley they look at embodied action and cognition in the sense that it's not just our brain that's thinking. And Aquinas would agree. I mean, you look at your whole organism and see how free will fits into that, and there's a kind of free will that involves all of these. So does that make sense?
Would you place habits as something within the brain? I mean, that potentially you could, I don't know, do a brain scan and run that there's a habitual pattern there, or?
There's certainly a whole number of them that would be located in the brain, but it depends on what faculty you're looking at. So if you're looking at motor faculties, or you look at muscle memory, it's probably not just the brain, but your body. If you're looking at associations, memory and imagination, yes, you would probably look at the brain. Habits of the intellect and of free will are a bit more tricky. And I'm actually not certain what to think of it. I mean, certainly a habit of the intellect would be knowledge, you know, that you can habitually call up and so forth. But what a habit of free will would be, I actually looked at that in Aquinas and tried to find something that's very marginal kind of comments he makes on that, but free will seems to be more the individual act of the free will based on other habits that you have formed, including intellectual habits. I'm actually also not certain what it means to talk about strength of will. It's curious. I mean, free will is, we haven't really talked about that, but free will is not adding more reasons or other things into your deliberation. Deliberation has already happened. Free will enters when your mind has specified the choice. And free will just says yes or no to that. Now that's actually complicated and also among the scholastics a debated question, but whether free will is a contradictory or contrary choice, whether you choose between A and B or between A and non-A. Now I'm inclined to say you need at least to have a choice between A and non-A true. Yeah, so let's say your intellect has reasoned it all through and you make a practical syllogism and there is your conclusion, you know, do X, you know. If you're a rationalist, like Leibniz or something, well, then the choice is already made. There's nothing else. For Aquinas, free will only comes at that point and says then either yes or no to that. But if that's a yes or no, that's a simple choice. But it's not a matter of degree, and I therefore don't quite know what strength of will would mean in that case. If you think of somebody, or torture is another perhaps gruesome example. You know? How long can you withstand torture? And you can say, well, a great strength of will, you know, I can endure that. But I'm wondering whether that strength of will is not rather dependent on other faculties that you have, especially the intellect. You know. If you have a strong enough intellect to abstract from the immediate circumstances and the pain and everything that goes with it, maybe then also you still have the freedom of choice, and that's what we call strength of will. Or else, you know, you're just so awash in pain, you're literally brainwashed, you know, that you cannot think clearly, and the focus of your intellectual deliberation shrinks to such a point that the most important thing seems to be just to avoid pain. And you're not even able to consider larger circumstances anymore. Then also you wouldn't be accountable for what you do there under torture. But that people might say that's a weaker kind of will, you know. But it's not primarily located in the will, but based on the other kind of faculties and what they are doing. Breaking someone's will, you know, would be explained along these lines.
Well, when we say that freedom depends upon truth, when we say that, I'm wondering if there's like a distinction between the discussion of free will and freedom, insofar that free will, I make an act that's not good for my being. Is freedom like something that's always directed to the truth, and therefore depends on?
Yeah, that's a good point. So if freedom presupposes rational deliberation, then anything that undermines that deliberation will take away from your freedom. So if you're deceived about something, yes, you still make a free choice, I would say, but there is where freedom has degrees, you know, I think. I guess we have to include that in the larger question of what freedom is. We haven't really exactly defined that yet. They're not working a lot of talk, but for Aquinas, free will is a teleological faculty, and it is the choice of the good. Choosing evil is not on the same level of freedom, if you want. It's actually lack of freedom in some sense. But in any case, it's not. Freedom is not primarily the choice between options. It is to be free to follow the good. That's how it's teleological. And it is a notion that has completely dropped out of the conversation, but without which many things become completely unintelligible, I think. So the ultimate good towards which we are programmed, if you want, is God. And the Beatific vision. That's what we want. And that good is natural to our free will, just as it is natural to heavy objects to fall to their natural places, as we'll say, to the center of gravity. So if I drop this pen, we call that free fall. Which sense of the word is that free? It's not that the pen chose to fall down, you know, but it follows its natural trajectory. And so the counter term for freedom here is not false so much, but it's exactly, it would be false for the thing to be thrown up. Aristotle calls that violent motion. So free motion and violent motion are opposed to each other. But the free motion is the one that follows the nature and the final cause, the telos of the thing. And that is true for the pen, and it is true for us. we also have our center of gravity, that is God. Or, if you want more neutral, Aristotle would say happiness. You know. Nobody wants not to be happy. Everything we choose is to be happy. Everything is subordinate to that ultimate universal good. And that can be concretized in a beatific vision if you want. And so, but that is a teleological understanding of the world. And so if we misunderstand what that good is, it's not precisely violent motion, but it would actually subtract from the freedom that is geared towards that good. You know? That's a privation of the will, you know? Just as blindness would be for sight. And that's basically what sin is. You know? Or, well, it could be also simple error. You know? But nevertheless, I mean, if you don't achieve your flourishing and your fulfillment by your choice, that is actually a lack of freedom. In that sense, I would take that comment.
And so that way we act with freedom with the use of our cognition. It's an act that's really intended to be in that direction, to be a saint.
Saints are the ones that are most free.
So you mentioned that free will is not a feeling, or it's not rooted in the feeling. I don't know if you could say some more, or go over again the idea that in the case of the alien hand, what we are missing precisely is an experience of authorship.
Yes.
So is there any kind of element of feeling or experience in free will?
I don't think necessarily. I mean, in the sense that Wittgenstein is right. I mean, if I lift my arm, I mean, that this is different from alien hand syndrome, but really my intention is not an added feeling or experience, but it's simply I wanted to do that. You know, the intention had reasons to do that, perhaps. You know? I wanted to demonstrate something in philosophy class, right? That's the reason. You know? And I know that reason, and that is evidence for me that that it was my intention to lift the arm. Not that there's an added experience to it. I mean, if it's about rational deliberation, if I calculate 2 plus 2 is 4, does that correlate with an experience? I mean, if any, then maybe very accidentally, so that it doesn't feel any way to think 2 plus 2 is 4. You know, there are feelings to thoughts, or to perform a syllogism or something like that. And so deliberation is not an experience in the feeling sense of the word, but it is a cognitive content. There are acts involved, but the acts are not themselves something we experience other than experience their content. You know? It's not that I move something from 2 plus 2 to be 4 and pushing some weights or something like that. Yeah.
But what about feelings, as you say, are passive? But in agency, we experience ourselves as a source of our actions.
Yes, that's
So
true.
how could we accommodate that?
It is an action, but I'm wondering whether every action must be also a possible object of sensual experience, which is what we're talking about. I'm not sure that's necessary. So we do know we are deliberating. We are deliberating, period. We are evaluating things morally and so forth, and that in a way implies some kind of freedom. And we know that we act on these deliberations, and I think that is just by seeing, well, I've done this now, I've seen after the fact, it seems that I was able to follow my deliberation. Maybe that's the only way in which the act becomes obvious as a rational deliberated act. Perhaps even within the very act itself, but it doesn't mean that it has an experiential component in this kind of sensual sense of the word. So I'm just wondering whether it's related to the old question whether you can know that you're in a state of grace. It is not, sort of you have the feeling of, having been in a revival meeting or something like that and having a conversion experience or something like that. Even that can be elusive in many ways, and the state of grace is in a similar way non-experiential and not an object that can be detected by introspection or something like that. So there's no assurance of salvation as certain Reformed traditions would suggest. That's at least the classic understanding. But I think that's a philosophical opinion for that. But I mean, there are other forms of evidence. For example, making promises. What's entailed in making promises? I mean, John Searle would say it's creating desire-independent reasons for action. So we have, if I have made a promise years ago to do X, Y, or Z today, then it doesn't matter how I feel about it today. I have made the promise. And I have desire-independent reason for action. And so I might act against all of these feelings and experiences based on reasons. And that's obviously important. I mean, let's take marriage. You make a marriage vow, or a religious vow. You have made that promise, and it doesn't matter later on how you feel about it. You still make that promise. You have made a commitment. You have an obligation. And the obligation is a reason for action, and it has nothing to do with feeling urges or readiness potentials or any of that. So promising is actually an important place to look at. Nietzsche actually knew that. Nietzsche says man is the animal that can make promises.
Can you speak to your perspective of the connection between free will and the development of self? Because it seems like if free will is this moving towards a more authentic who we could be, our authentic potentiality, it seems like the liberation reasons and these aspects of our lives are the distinguishing factors that make us who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just speak to that, or how you see it?
Well, I think we had Alan Weissenbacher coming in, right?
Who's it?
Alan Weissenbacher, I don't know how to pronounce
He already did. He came with
it.
the
Yes. So he did talk about the brain.
Yes.
And basically formation of habits and how the imagination is affected by that and how we can retrain our imagination and how that's important. And so I think that's, he gave the same talk yesterday, so I think it was the same. But I mean, I don't know if we mentioned that then, but he sort of wasn't too keen on doing things for willpower. Did he say that too? Oh.
No,
So basically, from experience or people working with addictions and so forth, I mean, just to clench your fist or something like that, and just by sheer willpower trying to do that usually fails. So, because, I mean, you have the whole barrage of your readiness potentials, your brain is being wired and the gaps are filled and whatever, to work against. And yeah, you might make individual choices that resist that, but I mean, with Aquinas, you would say collectively, in the long run, there will be some that we will succumb to, as long as you're wired that way. So he would say it's better to reprogram yourself, if you want, by different behaviors, by using your imagination, cognitive therapy perhaps, and even things, imagination in some cases can do the same thing as actual behavior. And so forth and so on. What I would add to that is, so it's not by sheer willpower, but you do make decisions. I mean, even to choose to rethink something or reorder your imagination or to interrupt a flow of imagination and they involve perhaps things that are easier to make because they're more remote from the actual temptation or whatever the case might be. So you're already set up for when that occasion arises. So while it's not sheer willpower, it doesn't mean that choices aren't involved. And then you will have a sort of ownership also of what happens if you arrive in a situation because you have prepared yourself, basically. And the military does that too. So, imagine how it will be if you're in a situation to make the right choices. So you use your imagination.
I'm thinking with that question like a vertical transcendence, like that ontological change when we make an act that is good, that we actually have a propensity to make that good act again.
Yeah, so that's John Paul II. Saying
yeah,
that. Yeah, no, but that's right. Whatever we choose influences who we become. Bad choices might, lead us down the road to addiction or something like that, and that is the character transforming through many ways. Good choices will also influence who we become, but they might not virtue, for example. So we had John Paul II was that we do choose, something out there, a particular action, but we transcend ourselves towards that. That's what he calls horizontal transcendence towards that which we do. But it also what he calls vertical transcendence, which sort of goes back on the agent. So every act, every choice we make also affects who we are. I don't know if vertical is a good term, but that reflects the freedom of basically influencing who we become. Other things?
Question. It sounds. Well, I'm just wondering if you could flesh out kind of the degrees of freedom, because it seems like on one end we have this very clear, deliberation that Aquinas is advocating as kind of the fullness of freedom. I'm just wondering how things sit, sort of, because oftentimes we don't make decisions quite so deliberately and with quite so much deliberation, and there's shades of kind of gray.
Yeah, I don't
Between
think
that
that's
and
so
the
much
other.
about the amount of deliberation. Again, if you build a skill that is also embedded in your choice is overarching, that. It's still something you have become because you chose to develop those habits. They don't necessarily subtract from the degree of freedom, but it is more the freedom you might gain by it. So if you are making bad choices, and then typically in the world of somebody who is stuck in sin, let's say, it's usually a very small world. Wittgenstein says that the world of a happy man is very different from the world of an unhappy man. And the facts might all be the same, every facts and stuff how the world is, but I think it's about the scope and the wideness of the world in which you live. In extreme cases, if you're addicted, all you can think of is your drug, and that's a very small world indeed. Whereas in terms of if you're a virtuous or wise man, you have actually by the habits that you form a certain kind of plateau in which you can operate. They're available to you. They actually give you a larger range of choices. They leave your mind free to deliberate greater goods, which is, if the will is teleologically ordered towards the good, it makes you also freer. So these are senses of the degrees of freedom that I would be looking for. And that makes sense.
So it's not necessarily more deliberation that creates more freedom, but
right. You can deliberate and make the wrong choices. It's still free choice, but as a consequence, you might actually be less free next time around. Whereas if you make the right choice, scope under which you look at things might be larger, and the possibilities you have are larger. In any number of ways, I mean, just intellectually, by what you, the wisdom that you might have gained, it might be by virtues of being abstemious and saving enough money, and then you have more options with that. I mean, you can think that on any number of levels. I think that will be true in that way.
So is it freedom, then a freedom of the will, something to aspire, or is there something native? And if the latter is true, where would it be rooted?
The free will certainly is, as a faculty, something that flows naturally, natively from the soul. That's what it just means to have a rational soul. The use of free will is another question. And in the ways that we just have said, I mean, freedom can grow by a good use. And so, in that sense, in one sense, it's native because it's a faculty. In another sense, it might not be because it can be developed. You can become more free, which is not so different from our intellect. Natively, we have an intellect, but whether we develop it and learn and so forth, that's up to us. And if we say that's growth of not so much of the intellect, but of, say, knowledge, And so it would be analogous. Now, there's of course, our faculty might also be natively affected by original sin. That's a theological topic. So if, then you can ask, well, how free are we really? And St. Augustine would say that Adam and Eve were much more free in paradise than we are now. And they could have freely chosen the good, I think he would say even without grace. But after the fall, that's definitely not possible anymore. And so there's a way, yes, we have a native freedom, but we are also dependent on grace and things like that. That's a theological kind of extension of the whole topic. But perhaps in secular terms, there might be the analogy of you might also natively be born with defects that get in the way of the ability to deliberate. So you might have brain damage that gives you readiness potentials or whatever that confuse your mind, and then the deliberation isn't so much possible, and then the scope of what you can freely do might also be encumbered, and people certainly will not hold that against you if that's really something you cannot help. Although I think that's always, some of us don't quite know how that would be like. If I think about somebody who is severely mentally incapacitated, they might not be able to think about a whole lot. What was Helen Keller able to think about before her mind opened up to acquiring knowledge and so forth?